It was an ordinary Tuesday night, the kind of night when most people just want to get home, kick off their shoes, and forget about the day. The streets were quiet, the sky dark, and the streetlights cast a dim glow over the road. Inside their car, Rebecca and her husband, James, were finally heading home. The day had been long and tiring, with the kind of tasks that make every minute feel like an hour. Both of them looked forward to a calm night, a peaceful evening to rest and recharge. Rebecca sat in the passenger seat, leaning back with her eyes half closed, her face calm but slightly weary. To anyone else, she looked just like any other woman heading home, blending into the ordinary rhythm of everyday life. She seemed relaxed, but there was something in her gaze, something quiet and powerful that lay hidden beneath her calm exterior. Her face was soft in the dim light, yet her eyes held a silent strength, an intensity that hinted at something more, something deeper and unspoken. Rebecca looked over at James with a small smile. He was focused on the road, driving with the care of someone who'd done it 1,000 times, familiar with every turn, every traffic light. James, too, looked like any other husband, just trying to get his wife home safely. Yet there was a quiet understanding between them, a kind of shared respect that came not from words, but from years of standing by each other through countless moments. To most people, they seemed like an ordinary couple living an ordinary life, with a routine that didn't call for much excitement or drama. But Rebecca was far from ordinary. Most people would never guess who she really was. Beneath the surface, beneath that calm smile and gentle demeanor, lay a secret life, a life that demanded strength, courage, and resilience. While many knew Rebecca as a kind, quiet woman, those who knew her well also knew about the fierce dedication she held, a dedication that she often had to keep hidden, blending into her day-to-day life, as if it were just another piece of clothing she put on and took off as needed. Tonight, as she sat there in the car, her thoughts drifted back to the day's events. It had been one of those days when every little thing seemed to go wrong. The endless meetings, the hurried conversations, the small yet exhausting demands of her job. Yet she hadn't let it wear her down. She kept her calm, her strength unwavering. To her, resilience wasn't just a word, it was a way of life. She'd learned long ago that staying calm on the surface often meant survival. James glanced over at her, sensing that she was deep in thought. He reached out, resting his hand gently over hers. "Long day?" he asked, his voice soft but understanding. Rebecca looked at him and nodded, offering a tired smile. "Yeah," she replied. "But it's over now. Just looking forward to getting home." She didn't tell him everything, though. James knew she had a tough job. He respected her for it, admired the way she balanced her responsibilities without ever letting on just how hard it sometimes was. But he didn't know the full extent of what she dealt with. Not tonight, at least. There were some things she kept to herself, not out of secrecy, but because she knew it was part of her role, part of what she'd chosen. And besides, she didn't want to burden him with details that she could handle on her own. As they drove, Rebecca looked out the window, watching the streetlights pass by in a steady rhythm. The lights flickered over her face, casting shadows that moved with each turn. She thought about the path that had led her here, to this quiet moment beside James, a moment that felt so ordinary yet carried within it the weight of countless challenges, risks, and decisions. She knew that beneath her calm exterior was a strength few people knew about, a strength she was sometimes called upon to reveal in ways that left her feeling both proud and humbled. The drive continued in silence, with just the soft hum of the engine and the occasional passing car. But in her mind, Rebecca was far from calm. She thought about the many roles she played, the quiet ways she influenced the world around her, often without recognition or praise. It was something she accepted, even embraced, because she understood that true strength didn't need to shout. It simply needed to be there, steady and unbreakable. Tonight, she sensed that things would be different, that something was coming, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. Perhaps it was just the weariness of the day, or perhaps it was something deeper, a sense that life, in its unpredictable way, was about to show her just how far her strength could take her. Whatever it was, she was ready. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain. She was prepared for it. She always was. Rebecca leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment, letting herself drift into a calm, centered place. The kind of place she often went to when things got challenging. A place where she reminded herself of who she was and what she stood for. It was a kind of mental armor she'd learned to wear over the years, a way of grounding herself so that nothing, no matter how difficult, could shake her. As they approached a quiet stretch of road, the streetlights became sparse and the darkness settled around them. There was a peaceful silence, one that often came with night drives on empty roads. But Rebecca's instincts were sharp, honed over years of dealing with unexpected situations. And tonight, that instinct was alert. There was something in the air, a feeling she couldn't shake. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, feeling that inner strength rise to the surface. She knew that life had a way of throwing curveballs when you least expected it, but she was ready for whatever was coming. And somehow, she sensed that tonight, she might need every bit of strength she had. This quiet drive, this ordinary Tuesday night, might just turn out to be something extraordinary. And though most people saw her as just another woman, she knew, deep down, that she was so much more. She was prepared for whatever the night would bring, with a courage few could understand and a determination that nothing could shake. As they reached a quiet, empty road, the hum of the car seemed almost soothing. The silence outside, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves, gave the road a peaceful feel. But suddenly, that peace was shattered. Flashing blue and red lights appeared in the rearview mirror, cutting through the night like a sudden alarm. The lights flashed in rhythm, casting a pulsing glow inside their car. James's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Stay calm," he said to Rebecca, his voice steady, though there was an edge of tension. He gently pulled the car over to the side of the road, and they came to a slow stop. The flashing lights continued to bounce around them, creating a tense atmosphere that neither could ignore. Rebecca looked out the window as two police officers stepped out of their patrol car, approaching them with slow, deliberate strides. The officers' faces were serious, almost stern. They had the look of people who were ready for confrontation, people who had assumed control over this moment before even knowing who they were dealing with. Rebecca sensed a mix of authority and suspicion in their expressions. She could tell by the way they walked, by the hard set of their jaws, that they were about to exert their power. "Step out of the car," one officer ordered, his tone firm as he directed his gaze at James. His voice was strong and final, leaving no room for question or delay. James hesitated but nodded, giving Rebecca a quick glance. It was a glance filled with silent words, a reassurance, a silent reminder to stay calm. Rebecca watched, remaining silent and composed, as James opened the door and stepped out. The officers kept their eyes on him, their expressions unreadable but focused. They were fully focused on James, barely giving Rebecca a second look. To them, she was simply a woman in the passenger seat, perhaps a nervous bystander, perhaps just another witness to their authority. In their eyes, she was no one special, just another civilian caught in a moment they had complete control over. Rebecca sat there quietly, observing the scene. She saw the officers' stance, their expressions, the way they held themselves as they spoke to James. It was clear they were used to situations like this, used to taking charge without question. Yet Rebecca noticed small details, tiny signs in their behavior that told her they thought they had full command. They were secure in their power, their authority, and they assumed James and Rebecca would do as they said without resistance. As James stood by the car, one of the officers began asking him questions, his voice carrying a tone of suspicion. "Where are you coming from tonight?" he asked, looking James up and down, almost as if he were searching for something to hold against him. His words came slowly, each one carrying a hint of distrust, as if he was waiting for James to slip up, to make a mistake. James kept his answers short and respectful, giving the officer no reason to doubt him. But the officer's eyes remained hard, unmoving, as if he was unwilling to accept anything at face value. Rebecca noticed this and felt a quiet unease rise within her. She knew that look, that tone, that subtle air of control. She had seen it before, countless times, in situations where people held power and assumed no one could challenge them. The second officer remained silent but observant, watching every movement, every word. He crossed his arms and glanced back at Rebecca once, barely acknowledging her presence. To him, she was just a background character in this scene, an extra who posed no threat or interest. In his mind, she was simply there, without purpose or relevance. Rebecca's eyes followed every detail, her gaze calm and steady, though inside she felt a growing tension. She could sense how they underestimated her, how they dismissed her presence, treating her as though she were invisible. It wasn't new to her. She was familiar with the feeling of being overlooked, of being seen as someone who didn't matter. But she knew better than to let that get to her. She knew who she was, and she knew her strength came from within, from a place few could see. James continued answering questions, his tone respectful but unwavering. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, and he was careful not to show any sign of fear. He was trying to stay calm, trying not to give the officers any reason to escalate the situation. Rebecca watched him closely, admiring his patience, his ability to stay composed under pressure. She knew it wasn't easy, but she also knew he was doing it as much for her as for himself. One of the officers moved closer to James, his posture stiff, his eyes narrow. There was a hint of challenge in his gaze, as if he were testing James, pushing him to see how he would react. The tension grew, thickening the air around them. Rebecca could feel it, a silent pressure that seemed to demand submission, obedience. She remained silent, keeping her gaze steady, but her mind was alert, taking in every word, every movement, every small detail. "Is there a problem, officer?" James finally asked, his voice steady, but carrying a hint of frustration. He wasn't trying to be defiant. He simply wanted to understand why they were being stopped, why the officers seemed so intent on questioning him without reason. The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced over at his partner, a silent exchange passing between them. Then he looked back at James, his expression hardening. "Just routine questions," he replied, his tone dismissive, as if he didn't owe them any explanation. Rebecca felt a spark of frustration rise within her. She could see what was happening. The officers were using their authority to push them, to remind them of who held the power. It wasn't about law or justice. It was about control, about asserting dominance. She knew this kind of behavior all too well, and it stirred something within her, a quiet determination that refused to be ignored. As the questioning continued, Rebecca remained silent, her expression calm, but her mind sharp. She listened carefully to every word, every subtle shift in tone. She noticed how the officers seemed to ignore her entirely, treating her as if she were simply part of the scenery. They didn't see her as a person with thoughts, with feelings, with strength. To them, she was invisible, unimportant. But Rebecca knew better. She knew her own strength, her own resilience. She had faced challenges far greater than this, situations that had tested her courage and resolve. She knew how to stay calm under pressure, how to keep her composure even when others tried to intimidate her. And tonight, she would do the same. The officers continued their questioning, their voices carrying a quiet threat, a subtle reminder of their authority. They were so focused on James, so intent on exerting their control, that they failed to see the quiet strength in Rebecca's gaze, the calm determination in her posture. They didn't see her resilience, her inner power. They saw only what they wanted to see, a passive woman, a silent observer. But little did they know, they were gravely mistaken. Rebecca felt her heart steady, her breathing calm. She knew that strength didn't always come from loud words or bold actions. Sometimes it was quiet, steady, a force that lay beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone, didn't need to shout or demand respect. Her strength was enough on its own, a silent power that couldn't be ignored. As the officers continued their questioning, Rebecca remained silent, her gaze unwavering. She knew who she was, knew her own strength, her own resilience. And though the officers couldn't see it, she knew that she was more than capable of standing her ground. James took a slow breath, his hands raised in a calm, respectful manner as he stepped out of the car. He moved with careful, measured steps, knowing that anything more could be seen as a threat. The night air was cool, but there was a heaviness between him and the officers, a silent pressure that both he and Rebecca could feel. He looked over at her for just a moment, a look that seemed to carry a silent message. Stay calm, stay strong. Rebecca's gaze didn't leave the officers. Her face was calm, almost serene, but her eyes were sharp, following every move the officers made, every word they said. She listened intently, her expression revealing none of the storm brewing beneath. She knew what was happening here. She knew the tone, the attitude, the dismissive edge in the officers' voices as they began their line of questioning with James. One of the officers, tall and broad-shouldered, stood just a few feet away from James. His face was set in a hard, unyielding expression, one that suggested he wasn't there to listen. He was there to assert control. "Where are you coming from tonight?" the officer asked, his voice carrying a tone that was sharp, almost accusing. It was less a question and more a challenge. James kept his voice steady as he answered, giving the officers simple, honest responses. But every time he spoke, the officer responded with a nod that seemed more suspicious than understanding, as if he were waiting to catch James in a lie, waiting for the smallest mistake. Rebecca observed this quietly, her gaze unwavering. She watched the officers' body language, noticed the way they stood, the way they seemed to look down on James, as if he were somehow beneath them. She could feel the unspoken tension in the air, a tension that came from years of dealing with people who believed they could control others simply by showing authority. But she knew better. She knew that true strength didn't come from barking orders or demanding obedience. It came from within, from a calm, steady resolve that couldn't be shaken. The second officer, slightly shorter but equally stern, walked around the car, glancing briefly in Rebecca's direction. He looked at her with a gaze that was both dismissive and suspicious, as if he expected her to be frightened, compliant, or simply silent. But Rebecca met his gaze, her expression calm and unwavering. She wasn't afraid, far from it. In fact, there was a quiet determination in her eyes, a hint of something strong and unbreakable. Yet she kept this strength hidden, letting the officers see only what they expected. A quiet woman, sitting in the passenger seat, observing. The questioning continued, each word from the officers growing more pointed, more impatient. James answered with patience, his voice calm, refusing to rise to their challenge. But Rebecca could see the frustration in the officers' eyes, could sense that they weren't satisfied with his answers. They wanted more control, more submission, more power. And that's when Rebecca felt it, that familiar spark of resilience, the inner fire that reminded her of who she was, of the strength she held within. As the first officer continued his questioning, the second officer walked back around to Rebecca's side of the car, stopping just outside her window. He leaned down, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her. There was a challenge in his gaze, a silent expectation that she would shrink, look away, or comply without question. But Rebecca didn't flinch. She looked back at him with a calm, steady gaze, her expression giving away nothing but quiet strength. "Ma'am," the officer said, his tone edged with impatience, "I need you to step out of the car." Rebecca glanced over at James, who gave her a subtle nod, a silent message of support. She took a slow breath, steadying herself as she opened the car door and stepped out. She moved with a quiet grace, a calmness that seemed to surprise the officer. He had expected compliance, perhaps even nervousness, but what he saw was something entirely different, a silent confidence that didn't need words or explanations. Standing outside the car, Rebecca felt the cool night air around her, grounding her, steadying her. She looked at the officer, meeting his gaze without a hint of fear. Her face was calm, her eyes steady, but beneath that calm exterior lay a fierce determination, a strength that few people ever got to see. The officer looked her up and down, his eyes narrowing as if he were trying to assess her, trying to figure out who she was. To him, she was just another civilian, just another person he could control with his authority. He didn't see the strength in her gaze, didn't sense the resilience that lay beneath her calm demeanor. And that was his mistake. "Where are you coming from?" the officer asked, his tone sharp, as if he expected her to falter, to hesitate. Rebecca held his gaze, her voice calm as she answered. She gave him the information he wanted, but she didn't offer anything more. She knew better than to give in to intimidation. She had dealt with tougher challenges than this, faced obstacles that required far more strength. And as she spoke, there was something in her tone, a quiet confidence that seemed to unsettle the officer. He shifted slightly, his expression hardening as he realized that she wasn't the easy target he had assumed. But he wasn't ready to let go of his authority. "Is there anything you're hiding, ma'am?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of accusation, as if he were trying to provoke her. Rebecca didn't flinch. She kept her gaze steady, her expression calm, even as she felt the tension rising. She could see what he was doing, could sense the need for control in his tone, but she wasn't about to let him shake her. She was stronger than that. And as she looked at him, there was a hint of something in her eyes, a quiet, unspoken challenge that he didn't quite understand. The officer took a step closer, his gaze hardening as he tried to reassert his authority. "Do you have anything to say, ma'am?" he asked, his tone carrying a thinly veiled threat. Rebecca looked at him, her expression still calm, still unshaken. She glanced over at James, who gave her a small nod, a silent signal that he trusted her, that he knew she could handle this. And in that moment, she felt a surge of strength, a reminder of who she was and the power she held within. Slowly, she looked back at the officer, her gaze steady, her voice calm as she finally spoke. "I don't think you know who you're talking to," she said, her words carrying a quiet authority that took the officer by surprise. He blinked, caught off guard by her tone, by the quiet strength in her voice. For a moment, he looked at her with confusion, as if he were seeing her for the first time. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected her to speak with such calm, quiet confidence, and in that moment, he realized that he had underestimated her. Rebecca held his gaze, her expression calm, but her eyes fierce. She knew that her strength wasn't something that could be seen on the surface. It was something deeper, something that came from years of facing challenges, of standing her ground even when others tried to push her down. And tonight, she was ready to stand her ground once again. The officer looked away, a hint of uncertainty in his gaze. He realized that this wasn't the easy encounter he had expected, that Rebecca wasn't the passive, compliant woman he had assumed. And as he stepped back, Rebecca felt a quiet satisfaction, a reminder that true strength didn't need to be loud or aggressive. It was calm, steady, and unbreakable. She glanced at James, who smiled at her with pride, as if saying, "They see it now." And as she looked back at the officers, Rebecca knew that they had finally seen a glimpse of the strength she held within. The strength they had so easily overlooked. Rebecca felt the weight of the moment press down, the tension thick around her. She knew she had reached a point where staying silent was no longer an option. She had given the officers every chance to treat her and James with respect, but they had crossed a line. They hadn't seen her strength. They hadn't even bothered to look. To them, she was just another face, just another person they could intimidate. She took a slow, steady breath, feeling the power of her own resolve growing within her. She wasn't going to let this moment pass without standing up for herself and for James. She knew exactly who she was, and it was time they knew as well. Rebecca took a single step forward, her movements calm and controlled. She felt the cool night air around her, grounding her, reminding her of the strength she carried within. She looked directly at the officers, meeting their gaze with a calm intensity that demanded attention. Her voice was steady and strong as she spoke, each word cutting through the silence with a quiet authority. "I think you should reconsider your approach," she said, her voice calm but firm, carrying a weight that couldn't be ignored. The officers looked at her, surprised by her tone. They hadn't expected this. They had assumed she would be passive, silent, willing to comply without question. But her voice, calm yet unwavering, held a power they hadn't anticipated. They exchanged quick, uncertain glances, their confidence momentarily shaken. The taller officer, his expression hardening, took a step forward, as if trying to reassert his authority. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he assumed was an ordinary civilian. Rebecca held his gaze, her expression unflinching. She could see the doubt flicker in his eyes, could sense his uncertainty as he tried to understand this sudden shift in the dynamic. She knew that he hadn't seen this coming, that he hadn't even considered the possibility that she might be more than what he had assumed. Without breaking eye contact, Rebecca reached into her pocket and pulled out her badge, holding it up for them to see. The small, shining emblem caught the light, reflecting a truth that couldn't be denied. She was no ordinary bystander. She was a high-ranking officer, a captain who had earned her place through years of dedication, strength, and resilience. The officers' faces shifted from surprise to shock, their eyes widening as they took in the badge in her hand. They stared at her, their expressions a mix of disbelief and horror. In that moment, they realized their mistake, a mistake that was painfully clear. They had misjudged her completely, assuming she was just another civilian, just another person they could dismiss and control. Rebecca allowed them a moment to process this revelation, to understand the full weight of their error. She could see the recognition dawning in their eyes, the slow realization that they had crossed a line they never should have. They had treated her with disrespect, with a lack of regard that was not only unprofessional, but also deeply wrong. The taller officer took a small step back, his face paling as he looked at her. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. He was at a loss, his confidence shattered in the face of her calm authority. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and he knew it. Rebecca lowered her badge, her gaze never wavering. She didn't need to raise her voice, didn't need to make any grand gestures. Her presence, her calm strength, spoke louder than any words could. She had shown them who she was, and that was enough. The second officer, still staring at her in shock, cleared his throat, his voice uncertain as he spoke. We didn't realize," he stammered, his words faltering as he struggled to find the right thing to say. He was visibly shaken, his previous confidence replaced by a nervous tension. He looked at his partner, who was equally stunned, as if searching for support, but there was none to be found. Rebecca watched them, her expression steady, her gaze filled with a quiet strength that they couldn't ignore. She could see the regret in their eyes, the realization that they had made a serious mistake, and she knew that this moment would stay with them, a reminder that assumptions, especially in their line of work, were dangerous. "You assumed," she said softly, her voice calm but carrying an edge of disappointment. "You looked at me, and you made a decision based on what you thought you saw. But you never bothered to ask, never bothered to consider who I might actually be." The taller officer, his face now filled with a mix of shame and regret, looked down, unable to meet her gaze. He knew she was right, knew that they had acted out of arrogance and assumption, and he knew that this was a mistake that would stay with him. Rebecca took a small step forward, her presence commanding but never aggressive. "I've spent years earning my place," she continued, her voice steady. "I've faced challenges you can't imagine, fought battles you've never had to fight, and I did it with respect, with integrity. I expect the same from you." Her words hung in the air, a quiet yet powerful reminder of the standards they were supposed to uphold. She wasn't just speaking as a captain. She was speaking as someone who understood the importance of respect, the importance of treating others with dignity, regardless of assumptions. The second officer, his face flushed with embarrassment, nodded slowly, his voice barely a whisper. "We're sorry, Mom," he said, his words filled with a sincerity that came from realizing the full weight of their error. "We didn't mean any disrespect. I didn't know." Rebecca looked at him, her expression softening slightly. She could see the regret in his eyes, the understanding that he had crossed a line, and while she was disappointed, she also knew that this was a lesson they wouldn't forget. "Respect doesn't require knowledge of rank or position," she said calmly. "It's something we should give to everyone, regardless of who they are. That's the standard we should hold ourselves to." The officers both nodded, their expressions filled with a newfound respect for her, a respect that came not just from her rank, but from the strength she had shown. They had seen a glimpse of her true self, her resilience, her dedication to doing what was right, and they knew that this was a lesson they would carry with them. Rebecca took a step back, her gaze still calm but her message clear. She didn't need to say anything more. She had shown them who she was, had reminded them of the importance of respect, and that was enough. She knew that her actions, her calm strength, would leave a lasting impression, a reminder that true power didn't come from authority alone, but from the strength within. As the officers stepped back, giving her the space she deserved, Rebecca felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. She had stood her ground, had shown them who she was, and in doing so, she had reminded them of what it truly meant to hold authority. She knew that they would remember this moment, would carry this lesson with them as they moved forward. And as she turned to look at James, who smiled at her with pride, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had faced the challenge, had revealed her true strength, and in doing so, she had not only claimed her own power, but had also reminded others of the importance of respect and integrity. The night air felt lighter, the tension dissipating as she and James shared a quiet, knowing glance. They both knew that this was more than just a confrontation. It was a moment of truth, a reminder of the strength that lay within her, a strength that could never be taken away. And as they walked back to their car, Rebecca knew that she had done more than just reveal her rank. She had reminded everyone present, including herself, of the power of resilience, the importance of standing up for what was right, and the strength that came from knowing who you truly were. Rebecca held her gaze steady, her face calm but resolute. She was a figure of quiet authority, someone who didn't need to raise her voice or make demands to be heard. She looked at each officer in turn, her eyes unwavering, making it clear that she expected respect, not just for herself, but for everyone they encountered on the job. The silence around them was thick, the weight of her presence filling the air, making it impossible for the officers to ignore the seriousness of the moment. The taller officer swallowed hard, his gaze dropping as he struggled to find the right words. He was visibly shaken, his confidence from earlier in the night completely shattered. He opened his mouth, starting to stammer out an apology, but Rebecca raised a hand, signaling for him to pause. She wanted him to listen, to truly understand the weight of his actions. "Listen carefully," Rebecca began, her voice steady, each word spoken with purpose. "Wearing this uniform comes with a responsibility to treat every person with respect, to serve and protect without prejudice. What you did here tonight was a failure of that responsibility." The officers looked down, shame written across their faces. The second officer, who had previously looked at Rebecca with nothing but suspicion, now stood quietly, his gaze fixed on the ground. It was clear that he hadn't expected this, hadn't thought for a moment that he would be the one under scrutiny tonight. But as Rebecca's words sank in, he couldn't deny the truth of what she was saying. Rebecca continued, her voice calm but firm. "When you put on this uniform, you are not just representing yourself. You represent every officer, every person who trusts you to do your duty with integrity. This behavior," she said, gesturing to their earlier actions, "damages that trust. It damages the respect that people should have for those in uniform. and that is not acceptable." The taller officer shifted uncomfortably, his face flushing as he realized the full extent of his mistake. He looked up at Rebecca, his eyes filled with regret, but he knew that apologies alone wouldn't be enough. He understood now that he had crossed a line, had misjudged her based on his own assumptions, and that assumption had led him to treat her with a level of disrespect that was not only wrong but completely unjustified. Rebecca's words hung in the air, leaving a deep impact that couldn't be brushed aside. She had spoken with authority, with a sense of justice that went beyond simple reprimands. This was a reminder of the principles that every officer was expected to uphold, a reminder of the importance of respect, of empathy, of integrity. The second officer cleared his throat, his voice low and filled with shame as he finally spoke. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. I didn't think. I didn't know." Rebecca turned her gaze to him, her expression softening slightly but remaining serious. "You didn't know because you didn't take the time to look. You assumed, and that assumption led you to act in a way that was disrespectful and unprofessional. It's not enough to follow orders, to go through the motions. You need to remember why you're here, what your duty truly is." The officers nodded, their faces reflecting a deep sense of regret. They realized now that this wasn't just about Rebecca's rank. It was about something much deeper, something that went to the heart of what it meant to serve and protect. They had failed, not only in their duty to respect her, but in their duty to uphold the values they had sworn to defend. Rebecca took a small step back, allowing her words to settle, giving them a moment to truly absorb the lesson she had imparted. She knew that this was a lesson they would carry with them, a lesson that would shape the way they approached their duties in the future. And she hoped that this would be a turning point, a moment that would remind them of the importance of humility, of respect, of integrity. James stood nearby, watching the scene unfold with quiet pride. He knew that Rebecca's strength went beyond rank or authority. It was a strength that came from her character, from her unwavering commitment to justice and respect. He felt a sense of pride knowing that this was the woman he stood beside, someone who not only commanded respect, but also inspired it in others. Rebecca took a deep breath, letting the tension of the moment ease slightly. She knew that she had done what she needed to do, had spoken her truth in a way that would leave a lasting impact. She didn't need to say anything more. Her message had been clear, her words a powerful reminder of the values that every officer should uphold. The taller officer, his face filled with a newfound respect, looked up at her, his voice filled with sincerity as he finally spoke. "Thank you, Captain. I won't forget this." His words were quiet, but they carried a weight that told her he truly meant it. This was a lesson he would carry with him, a reminder of the responsibility he bore every time he put on the uniform. Rebecca nodded, acknowledging his words. She didn't need praise or recognition. She simply needed them to understand the importance of their duty, to remember that respect was something that should be given freely, not based on rank or position. And as she looked at them, she knew that this was a lesson they would carry forward, a lesson that would shape the way they served. The second officer, still visibly humbled, nodded as well, his expression filled with a new sense of purpose. "Thank you, ma'am. We were wrong, and I'm sorry. I'll remember this." Rebecca offered a small, encouraging nod, her face softening slightly. She could see that they had learned, that they had taken her words to heart. And in that moment, she felt a sense of satisfaction, knowing that she had made a difference, had reminded them of the importance of respect, of integrity, of the duty they had to uphold. As the officers stepped back, ready to return to their vehicle, Rebecca turned to James, sharing a quiet, knowing smile. The night had started as one of tension and intimidation, but it had ended with a lesson, a moment of accountability that would leave a lasting impact. James reached out, gently squeezing her hand, his eyes filled with pride. "You handled that beautifully," he said softly, his voice filled with admiration. Rebecca smiled, a quiet sense of accomplishments settling within her. She knew that she had done what was right, had stood up for herself and for the principles she believed in. And as they watched the officers drive away, she felt a sense of peace, knowing that justice had been served, not through anger or aggression, but through respect, through integrity, through the quiet strength that defined her. The road stretched out before them, calm and peaceful once more, the tension of the night left behind. And as they drove away, Rebecca knew that this was a night they would all remember, a night that had reminded everyone present of the importance of respect, of humility, of the true meaning of service. Rebecca leaned back in her seat, her heart filled with a quiet satisfaction. She knew that she had made a difference, had reminded those officers of the duty they held, of the respect they were expected to show, not just to her, but to everyone they encountered. And as they drove through the night, leaving the scene behind, she felt a sense of closure, a sense of justice that was both satisfying and deeply fulfilling. As Rebecca and James drove away from the scene, a quiet calm settled over them, replacing the tension that had filled the air just moments before. The soft hum of the car, the gentle rhythm of the road beneath the tires, it all felt peaceful now, almost soothing. Rebecca gazed out the window, her mind drifting over the events of the night. She hadn't planned for any of it to happen, hadn't expected to reveal her rank, her authority. But in that moment, she knew she had made the right choice. She had stood up for herself, for James, and for something greater, respect and dignity. Rebecca felt a deep satisfaction, knowing she had done more than defend her own honor. She had reminded those officers of the values they had promised to uphold, of the duty they carried to treat everyone with fairness, kindness, and respect. She knew that her words, her quiet strength, would stay with them, shaping their choices in the future. They might never forget the night they misjudged her, the night they learned that true authority isn't always loud or obvious. It's often calm, patient, and firm. She thought about the lessons she'd learned over her years of service. She had faced challenges that tested her courage and resilience, challenges that required her to remain steady, calm, and focused. Over time, she had discovered that real strength didn't need to shout. It didn't need to demand attention. It simply existed, a quiet force that couldn't be shaken. And tonight, she had shared that strength with those officers, not through anger or intimidation, but through dignity and integrity.